CGI, the vendor that built healthcare.gov, built the Kentucky Exchange as well. So what does that tell you, right? Or what does that make you ask, right? What was the problem? What happened to healthcare.gov that caused such a colossal failure on one hand, right? But allowed the Kentucky Exchange, fundamentally the same problem, right? Getting people enrolled in a government service. On one hand, it worked really well. And on another hand, it worked so really badly, right? Well, Clay Shirky, who always has something smart to say, talks about culture. He says the problem was the culture in Washington that managed the process was broken. He wrote this. He says, the vision of technology is something you can buy according to a plan and then have delivered as if it was coming off a truck. Flatters and relieves managers who have no idea and no interest in how this stuff works. But it's also a breeding ground for disaster. This is the waterfall method of delivery, right? So they didn't use Agile, right, in DC. Basically, they said, we want this exchange built and delivered on day X, right? Just do that. We don't care about the process. We don't care about testing. We don't want it built and tested and rolled out in the way all of us know how technology should be built and tested and rolled out with users first. We just want it delivered. We want to close our eyes and just want it to work. And this is why you saw such a colossal failure on one hand, and on the other hand, you saw it work. Because there is a deep and profound ignorance on the hand of some people in the way just technology works. And what I wanted to talk to you guys today about is that is no longer acceptable in the 21st century. Because in the 21st century, nearly every single thing the government does is going to have some technology component to it, ranging from healthcare to immigration to cap and trade to gun control and to schools. And we're going to talk about some of those examples. All of these things are going to have a technological component. And the reality of government in the 21st century is technological and inevitable. And understanding how technology works, the process, the culture, and the methodology behind it is now a requirement for the public sector. And people like you, people who understand technology and the processes behind it, need to get in the game. Because otherwise, failures like healthcare.gov are going to be commonplace. And it's going to cost people healthcare, social services, and frankly, all of us, lots of tax dollars, like we're seeing every day. So that's what I wanted to talk to you guys about. I just want to say before we get going, it's a small group, so feel free to interrupt me anytime with questions, thoughts. We can have a conversation as we go on. So just a bit of background. So for the last 4 years, I was running an organization called Code for America. Have you guys heard of Code for America before? Great. So I'll just give you a quick high-level summary. We're a Peace Corps for geeks. It was started 4 years ago with this kind of basic notion that the public sector too often doesn't understand technology. What Code for America does is it really focuses on the cities. The idea basically being that our city governments deliver a lot of core services, right? Ranging from picking up your trash to making sure your kids get to school on time, right? But so often there's a technological illiteracy. And so the core notion modeled off of Teach for America or the Peace Corps was let's send a team of developers inside City Hall. We worked with cities ranging from Philadelphia for actually 2 years to cities like Macon, Georgia, to Honolulu, though I didn't get my trip to Honolulu expensed because I'm somehow dumb, I don't know. And what we do is we follow an agile process, right? Is the fellows, so these are developers or designers, will go into a city and take on a hard problem, right? And I'll give you an example of one in a minute. But take on a problem like enrollment in food stamps or the school selection process, research it, and then prototype a solution. And just that itself is really powerful, right? Because it shows the government, right, in contrast to healthcare.gov, what delivery looks like, right? What an MVP, a minimally viable product, looks like. And then they keep testing and making it better over time. And that itself just ushers in a culture change. But beyond that, right, you start to build really great technology. But beyond just the altruistic goals, it's a nonprofit. There is, by the way, a really huge financial upside in the public sector, if you guys don't know. So just to put it in perspective, so the iOS market, so all the apps in the App Store, do you guys know how much money is spent on the iOS market? It's about $2 billion. Do you know how much money is spent on video games? It's about $10 billion. The public sector technology market is $172 billion this year. $172 billion. So just take a second. Think about that. So this is a massive opportunity for disruption. Massive opportunity for disruption. And the technology they're using right now, as you can tell by healthcare.gov and a lot of the other technologies that you probably use when you try to go to the DMV, for instance, or any other government website, isn't great. So there's a huge opportunity here, and that's what Code for America is trying to draw attention to, right, is that there are opportunities. So let me give you an example of the kind of things that Code for America does. This is a post written by one of our fellows. Sorry, it's not rendering too well on the screen here. People, Not Data, written by Jake Solomon, one of the fellows from last year. I say fellows because the people who participate in the Code for America program are fellows. There's about 20 or 30 of them each year. It's called People, Not Data. He has this great line. So Jake and a team of 3 other fellows worked in San Francisco around food stamps. CalFresh is the program in California around food stamps. And what we'd ask the fellows to do is, to the extent possible, try to be like somebody in that government program, right? So often for so many of us in the technology sector, a lot of the public sector programs we don't see, right? I've never been on food stamps myself, so I don't know what that's like, right? I've never gone through a lot of the social services that people in the public sector have to go through, so I don't know what that experience is. So if I were to design software for it, it would be hard for me to do. Well, we ask the fellows to put themselves in that experience, and then they can actually start to develop software for it. And so Jake, one of the fellows, and the other ones went into a social services center in San Francisco, and this is what he saw. He says, I was there in San Francisco, one of the greatest and most prosperous cities in the country, watching a man on his knees struggling to hear through bulletproof glass, trying to access nutrition assistance from our federal government. So this is one of the social services centers in San Francisco, and basically this was a man trying to talk to somebody, but because of the way the system's set up there, and there's this long line, so he used to wait all day, and because of the screen and the mic, the way it's set up, he had to get down on his knees to try to talk. And these are the kind of basic design challenges that you have to go through. So that was just a vivid example of just how broken the process is. The real problem that they identified was actually that there's this thing called churn. So basically, people on food stamps get kicked off without knowing. You get sent this stuff in the mail that you can't sometimes read if you don't speak English, that oftentimes the language is way too complicated, and so you get kicked off, right? So you'll show up at the grocery store not knowing that you no longer have food stamps and not be able to pay for your groceries, right? And that's really embarrassing, and then you have to go back in that line, back on your knees, and back trying to get re-enrolled, right? And so this is a huge problem for people in the social services sector, right? So they built a simple piece of technology. It's called Promptly. Simple enough, it just text messages people to say, by the way, you might be being kicked off of food stamps. That simple. Like, this isn't complicated technology. What was complicated, though, was things like this. They had to lift the ban on digital communications. A lot of HSA departments, human services agencies, actually have bans that they can't send text messages because they think it's not secure communications. So the fellows had to work with the city to lift that ban. So now San Francisco is the first HSA that can actually send texts to different departments, and now we're rolling that out across the country. So now, almost soon, every HSA will be able to do that. And again, a huge opportunity for new technology. So we shouldn't just be sending texts if you're going to get kicked off. Think beyond that. Get a text when every time the good new social services center is open. Beyond that, right? You could do a lot of different things once you can start using new tools, right? There was another problem, right, which is that even once you lift the ban, people have to opt in. So how are you going to get people opted in to getting the text? Well, we asked people to do an enroll-a-thon. You guys have probably heard of a hackathon, right? Well, we did an enroll-a-thon at our offices in Code for America. We asked people to come in and just pick up the phone and call people and say, would you mind getting texts from your HSA? This is a way to get community involvement to actually solve some of these civic problems. And what's cool about it is once you start to use technology, people tend to think of government as these institutions where people hate their jobs or don't care. But in fact, people really do care inside these institutions. Just so often they're trapped by the bureaucracy. But technology can open that door. And that's what we found, right? Like, once the fellows went in there, gave them some new technology, showed them what's possible, they started doing all new things. Actually, one of the people that the fellows were working with started redesigning the actual flow of the physical space in one of the social services centers. Like using user experience principles within the physical space. right? So this stuff is like viral in a certain way. It's kind of cool. And then, of course, there's the effect on citizens, right? The citizen said he was taken aback when he got his first text from the city. Simple technology with big impacts, right? So I wanted to give you that example because this is what Code for America does, right? It's really just going in, building simple tools, small tools, but I think with big impacts. And that's really opening the door for innovation, which I think now signals a huge opportunity for technologists to get in the game, talking about that $172 billion number, and make a huge impact, both financially and from a civic perspective. So now I want to give you guys some examples of, I think when we think about scale and kind of the broader impact, some of the other things that are happening in this space. So this notion of agile policy. Seems a little crazy, but it's actually kind of happening. So this was actually a fellowship project from 3 years ago that's actually taken a life that spanned even beyond that and had really big implications. So in the city of Boston 3 years ago, there was this, in 2011, a big problem around school selection. How many of you guys have kids? And how many of you guys struggle with picking which schools your kids can go to or should go to? Sometimes it's a complicated process, and plus it's just a very important question, right? And so in the city of Boston, it actually became such a problem that some people wanted to leave the city, right? Ultimately, it's possible that we'll leave the city because it doesn't work out the way we want them to. It was just really complicated, and here's why. This was the book that the city sent parents. It was a 30 to 40 page booklet like this that parents couldn't make heads or tails of, right? This was the user experience that parents got sent. And so it was really complicated, right? And these are really important life decisions for parents and their kids, right? And that just doesn't feel right. At the first day of the fellowship, the first year, we asked each of the fellows to stand up and say, why are you here? You know, these are guys who are leaving full-time jobs at Google, Facebook, Microsoft to take a year of public service to work with cities, right? A huge pay cut, hard job working with city government. And one of the fellows got up and said, I believe the interfaces to government can be simple, beautiful, and easy to use. This is not an interface to government that is simple, beautiful, and easy to use. This kind of is. So this is what they built. This is Discover BPS. It's kind of like a Yelp for schools. You type in your home address, and it tells you which schools your kid's eligible for, right? What's cool is that instead of like saying just these are the schools in your area, and these are the ones you're potentially eligible for, it also puts in things like walk score. So it tells you which ones your kid could potentially walk to, right? Some just simple things that you can start to build in once you start to use technology, right? Basic stuff. So we built that in about 6 weeks, 8 weeks, really fast, and that, again, showed the school department what's possible. But again, Agile, right? Agile's all about testing, building over time, focusing on users and getting better. And so they did that, and this was V2, even better, right? They just launched this about end of last year. And along with it, they put up ads throughout the city. They put up big billboards throughout Boston to get a lot of users. And now about half of the parents within Boston have used Discover BPS to find schools for their kids, right? So this is civic technology actually getting in the hands of users and actually making a difference. But beyond that, initially the school department was really hesitant. They're like, we don't know if we want to open up all this data. We don't know if we want to make this whole process online. Well, after seeing the tool, after seeing all the parents start to use it, this is what the superintendent said. It changed the way the school department relates to parents, right? So technology ushered in this really big change for the school department itself, culturally, which, talking about agile policy, led to what I think is one of the most exciting opportunities for technology in government. So beyond just putting a nice interface on the school selection process itself, there was this long-standing debate within Boston for about 40, 50 years around kind of the notion of school identification, right? The idea that my kid is eligible just for the schools in, say, a 1 mile radius seems a bit funky, right? Like, my kid might be really good at math and might be really interested in science and good at sports. So maybe he should go to these 3 schools that are a little bit further away but make more sense for him based on his interests and passions, right? Well, I mean, an algorithm could figure that out, right? So why couldn't we build an algorithm to do that and then assign schools on that? As technologists, we all get that, right? That makes sense to us. But for government, right, sometimes that's totally foreign. But once we built this app for them, Discover BPS, that turned on the light bulb for them. They started getting that. And this guy, Peng Shi, actually built that algorithm for the school department, and actually they've now implemented that process, this algorithm, for Boston Public Schools. So going from this hard, rigid process of school selection to algorithmic school identification. So fundamental reform for the entire way that city assigns schools for kids.
I don't know what the number is in Boston, but Philadelphia, about 40% of the Philadelphia public schools don't have any internet access.
Yeah.
So how did they address, so assuming there's a somewhat comparable number, how do they address the 30, 50, whatever,
Sure.
that don't have access to the school?
So access is a great question. So two things on that. One is looking at the numbers. So in Boston, because we focused on education, we looked really closely at that. Turns out that in schools in particular, or for kids, they tend to not have PCs or computers at home, but almost all of them have these, almost all. And they tend to have data plans because a data plan is like 30, 40 bucks a month, and they don't want to put out $700, $800 for a PC, but they will put out $30 a month for this. And so Discover BPS is mobile responsive, and it works really nicely on a phone. So that's why you're able to get good user numbers. Beyond that, so the second point is, what we really proactively do, and frankly we have to get better at, and when I say we, I'm talking more broadly about civic technologists, is thinking about non-traditional ways to get technology in the hands of users. So libraries, right? Other public access areas. Like there are ways to find venues where you can deliver this technology into people's hands that may not be giving them a computer or a device, but getting access. Does that make sense?
So whether or not, does somebody have to sign up to do that school selection and stuff like that, or is the Boston doing for every travel and have to access this website?
No, they've changed the whole process. So everybody is now using that.
What do you do? Your grades and stuff at elementary level or something like that, or can you fill out and say, this is what you do?
I think it's a host of different things. I don't know it that well. I can send you the article if you give me your contact information. You can take a look at it. I think it's primarily your grades, your siblings, where they go to school, your address, and I think your interests. So. And just to wrap up on this story, this is what Joel Mahoney was the lead developer, one of our fellows on this. This is what he wrote, which was, consider what it means that school departments can no longer pin assignment zone maps on the wall since the algorithm generates a unique list of eligible schools for each address, right? It's just a very different way to think about policy in the 21st century, right? Which I think is a pretty interesting lens. And now bringing it back to this, I think a higher level, the reason part of this was possible is because Boston has this really cool department, which like frankly is like a title that I would love to have at one point, Department of New Urban Mechanics. So a lot of cities, because it's a challenge sometimes to innovate, are trying to create these new offices of innovation or urban mechanics where they're putting in kind of R&D shops or innovation labs where they're saying, this is a space where you're free to innovate. You're free to try new things, to run, for instance, agile processes. Nigel Jacob and Chris Osgood are the two co-chairs of New Urban Mechanics in Boston. What's cool about it is because they got some success in Boston doing this, they're the ones who brought in the fellows and did the school project. They actually worked with Philadelphia to stand up New Urban Mechanics here. So Philadelphia also has a Department of New Urban Mechanics as well, run by Story Bellows. And a bunch of other cities have them as well. So if you see here now, about 13 different cities across the country have some kind of either Office of Innovation or Department of New Urban Mechanics or something like that. And what's great about these is because they usually have strong support from the mayor, they have the license to either try out new projects or budget to actually support new startups or new companies that are willing to try on interesting things. So if you're a civic startup or you're a tech company wanting to try something new with a government, these are the types of shop that are willing to go around some of the traditional barriers to working with government, like procurement or just the status quo. And in Philadelphia in particular, they have a program called Fast Forward, which is kind of an urban accelerator to work with modern technology projects. So I've been using this word civic startups a lot, and I wanted to give an example of one of those. When I use the word civic startup, that means basically a modern government technology company. And Code for America actually incubates them and accelerates them, so we actually find some of the best ones across the country, give them some support and some funding to help them get off the ground and scale. And so here's an example of one that came out of New Orleans. So this is what blight looks like in New Orleans. As you guys are probably familiar, right, in the wake of Katrina, blight or vacant housing was a big problem in New Orleans. Turns out, though, blight's a big problem for almost every American city. I'm sure for those of you in Philadelphia, you know it's a big problem here, too. I know Mayor Nutter has made it a big focal point of his administration is to deal with vacant housing here. It's just the fact of the way urbanization's worked in this country is that there's a lot of empty homes. Empty homes turn out to be a big hotbed for crime. So this is a big problem. And in fact, the mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu, was walking around the city with a CIO one day and said, you know, I want to know what the status of each of these vacant houses is. Why can't I just walk around, see a house, and know what my city's doing about it? And the CIO said, I would love to be able to tell you, but it's going to cost me $3 million and take me 3 years to build you that app, right? Because he was thinking about the waterfall method. He was thinking about all of the different databases that he had. He was thinking about how much time it would take to get a traditional vendor and a traditional consultant to bring it in and build it. Well, our fellows went in and built blight status in about 6 weeks. Because they were able to build a minimally viable product. They were able to be lean and agile, just get the data and just throw something up there. Of course, they had to test it over time and make it better over time. It took them a while to get it into something that's great, but they were able to just get it done fast, right? But that's actually not the most interesting part. So that's the homepage. Of course, you can drill down and see the status when you go into a particular property location. They've turned it now into a startup and are taking it city to city. When I traveled around the next year and went to the 10 different cities that Code for America was working with the next year, every single mayor said, I don't care what you build for me, if you just get me blight status in my city, that's all I want. That's all. So cities have common problems. And so if you build a good solution, there's an opportunity to redeploy it city to city. So there is a real opportunity for reusable civic technology. So yeah, 3 years, $3 million, and instead 6 weeks. But here's what I thought was really interesting about it. So they built this tool in part because the mayor wanted to understand what the status of the properties was. Turns out when they were doing user research, they met this woman. Her name's Miss Rita. That's a map that she keeps in her living room. And if you go to her house in New Orleans, which I did, you'll see throughout her house, she actually keeps these big maps throughout her entire house. Because for her and other people in the community, blight's a big problem. It's a personal problem for her, right? Because when these houses are vacant, she's scared because there could be crime all around her, right? It could be a problem. So she and other people in her community keep track of the blighted houses herself. She basically keeps her own personal version of blight status on her walls, right? Because she wants to know the status. And so for her, an application like blight status was a godsend. When they actually launched the application, she ran up to one of the fellows and gave him a hug. She loved it. And it turns out the biggest user of blight status now is Habitat for Humanity. So they've signed up for updates of from the tool because they now use it to rebuild houses in New Orleans. And the reason I bring this up is because sometimes, and this is getting back to the Agile point, sometimes the users of a civic app, sometimes the user of a tool is unknown, right? Sometimes you have to build it because the mayor wants you to, right? But by getting it out there, getting in the hands of users, and seeing what happens, seeing what emerges, you realize where the real value lies, right? And here they found out the real value, sorry, I got cut off, it says civic power users. The real value was here, right? The real value is Habitat. And so now they're working with Habitat nationally to find out where they want to use this tool over and over again. And that's a really powerful partnership, right? And so that's just another example of civic tech that scales and civic tech that really has an impact. And this is what Fast Company wrote about that when it went live, is the app proposes a new kind of more productive communication between two groups that moves past angry and frustrated citizens on one end and the paralyzed citizen on the other. So the app changes the conversation, right? So beforehand, Miss Rita was like, I don't know what the city's doing. The mayor didn't know what the city was doing. And now you actually have a common table for them to sit at and say, now we know what's going on. Let's figure this out. and Habitat can actually sit there as well and say, I can help. And so civic technology actually enables people to work together in a way that they couldn't do in the past. And so that's just one example of civic startups. There's a huge and emerging field here. These are some of the other civic startups that Code for America has accelerated in the past. MindMixer does citizen engagement, basically getting citizen feedback. Philadelphia has a platform that's live, getting citizen feedback as well. Aunt Bertha does social services discovery, so if you want to find out where you can get job training or find food stamps. Captricity takes paper forms and makes them digital. They help save the state of California hundreds of millions of dollars by doing that. So, and they're helping also work with the GSA and the VA as well to do that same kind of process. So, huge explosion of civic startups getting out there. And these are basically enterprise SaaS companies, right? But focusing on government and finding a lot of traction. And so this, I almost don't want to talk about this because I work for Code for America, but I kind of have to, because if you want to talk about government using technology well, I kind of have to talk about these guys. So this is gov.uk. This is the government digital service from the UK. And if I had a British accent, I would do this part of the talk with a British accent because I should. And the UK government 4 or 5 years ago, they realized that they really needed to start taking technology seriously. A guy named Mike Bracken, who had been on the outside of government, doing a lot of innovation, kind of like Code for America has been doing on the outside of government. They brought him in-house, gave him a lot of authority and a lot of budget, and he started bringing in top-notch talent to start just going at the problem of technology within government. And what he did is he was really smart about it. He started by writing just a set of principles for how government should use technology. And they're going to sound like very common principles to anybody who knows anything about Agile. Start with needs. And he did some other nice things, which is like in their office, he cut out something from their window so they could see users on the street of London. So they always kept in mind the people they were building technology for. And here are their principles that they use for every piece of software that they build in the UK. And here was their approach. They just took every single website that the UK had. And here's the thing about government. Government has thousands and thousands of websites. It's not just one website. Like every agency has thousands of websites. Thousands. They actually had to put a freeze on all .gov domains. I don't know if you guys know that. In the US, they actually put a freeze. Vivek, under the former CIO, said no more. I'm not going to handle this. They said no. And so, and the UK, they just started taking them down and then putting them back into one unified website, gov.uk. And it's actually pretty good because they've just said, we want one simplified citizen experience for the government. And turns out, by doing that, by building a really great interface, by having these principles, by having strong leadership, you can recruit great people. Somebody actually told me once that other startups in London are actually really angry now because people are going to work for Mike at the GDS instead of going to startups. Some people have called it the sexiest startup in London is the government. Think about that for a second. The sexiest startup in London is the government. So norms are shifting, right? You're seeing government get exciting and you're seeing things change. And now what they're starting to do is actually not just make the website better, which is an important first step, right? That's information delivery. They're actually now moving to what they're calling transformation, which is making actually able to do things like enroll in services online, right? So actually government delivery online. That's really the next step for all of this work, which is being able to do fundamental services online. It's harder to do, as you can imagine, right? Because that requires integration with some existing systems, but they're able to do it. The other cool thing, while I'm just talking about GDS, is because they started recruiting so many people, now GDS is 500 people. They have a staff of 500. They initially didn't have oversight of the government IT spend, but over time, the other departments that were buying projects knew that they had smart people. They're like, could you come and consult with us on this project? Just we're about to talk to a vendor. Do you mind giving us an idea or just looking at this RFP? They're like, sure. First time they gave them some thoughts. Second time they gave them some thoughts. Third time they actually just showed up with a demo or a prototype. And the consultant had come in and said, it's going to cost you $30 million to build it. And GDS is like, we've just built the prototype. And so you're just, it's radical what happens when you start just building stuff, right? You save money and you actually build better interfaces. And by the way, you start to save lives. So they started doing this, they did this interesting thing, organ donation and A/B testing. So they did this on one of the interfaces. They just said, what if we started encouraging people to opt in to donate organs? Just encouraging people. Let's test out a lot of different things. I don't know if you guys saw, but with the Obama campaign, they did a lot of smart things with A/B testing just to encourage people to donate more, right? So of course you can do a lot of stuff with A/B testing. I'm sure you guys do it in your work all the time, right, to optimize whatever technology you're building. Government could do the same thing and think about all the social outcomes you could have there. Well, they started doing the same thing too with encouraging people to enroll in organ donations. With one link, they got 350,000 more donors. One link. And this is just the UK, 30 million people. Imagine doing that in the US. So now we're starting to. So my former boss, Jennifer Polka, who was the founder of Code for America, is now the deputy CTO of the US government. Her, along with Todd Park, who is the CTO of the US government, they're starting this called 18F. So the Code for America Fellowship Program was modeled by the White House took that program and created a Presidential Innovation Fellowship, which are basically 20 to 30 developers and designers working at the federal level to kind of promote innovation. They've now taken that and created basically a GDS-style institution at the federal level called 18F to model some of the UK learnings in America, right? Which makes me less bad about the whole UK thing, the expat thing. And what's great, what are they actually going to do? Partner with agencies to deliver high-quality in-house digital services using agile methodologies, right? Deliver working prototypes, offer digital tools, transparency, right? So they're going to try to practice what they preach, right? They're going to try to actually do the same stuff that's been working in the UK here at home. So they're just getting started. They have a couple of initial pilot projects. The Presidential Innovation Program has been pretty successful, so there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic here. To be honest, I mean, the US government is a very different animal than the UK. It's not centralized in any of the same ways, a lot bigger, so they've got a big challenge ahead of them, but there's some great people working on that project, so I'm excited to see what comes next. So those are some examples of what's happening in this space, some principles, I think, and some reasons to be excited. But beyond those, I think there are ways to be more civic without actually going into a civic technology company or going into government. My friend Nick Grossman likes this phrase, instead of building civic apps, you can make all apps a little bit more civic. So there's been this explosion of open data. So government's opening up the wealth of data that they have, right? Data ranging from social services, for instance, I was talking about earlier, or school data that I was talking about, to things like restaurant inspection scores. So if you guys remember, like when you go to a restaurant, you've probably seen the back hidden somewhere, like the A, B, C ratings from if it's healthy or not, right? Usually restaurants hide that somewhere that you can't find it. Well, usually you want to find that out before you sit down, right? And wouldn't it be great if you found that before you even picked out the restaurant? Well, that's all government-owned data, right? The government does those inspections and has that data. So what we did is we actually worked with the government to open up that data in a standardized format, an open data standard, and then we worked with partners like Yelp to actually integrate those restaurant inspection scores with Yelp, right? So now when you go on Yelp in San Francisco and a bunch of other cities now, you can find that open civic data in Yelp. So this is an example of open data going from hidden in the back of a restaurant into the palm of your hand, right? We also did something similar at Trulia around code enforcement data. So this is like when you're searching for an apartment or a place to live, and you want to find out if the landlord's a good guy, like have they been keeping the building up to code and safe? Well, again, usually that data is really hard to find. You don't know it until after you sign on the apartment. Well, now it's in Trulia. So right when you're looking up for a new apartment, it's also in Live Lovely. It's also in a bunch of other major platforms that you've searched for apartments on. We've taken that data that was initially hidden, that was initially hard to find, and put it right where consumers are. And so for any of you that are working on any consumer-facing platform or have any platform that potentially has consumer implications, you should think about all of the wealth of data that government has, which is tons. And I promise you, it's only going to get more and more every day. In 1 year alone, Code for America opened up about 4,000 data sets. And that's just Code for America. The federal government's opened up probably 1,000 data sets every day. All of that is an opportunity to make your products more meaningful and more valuable. and it's not that hard. We did most of these projects in a couple of weeks. So those are opportunities that are, again, lighter weight ways to make your civic apps more valuable. And so just in closing, I was going to say that Tim O'Reilly, who's on Code for America's board, likes to remind me that government is what we do together, right? That at the end of the day, that government is kind of our responsibility of what we do. And the chapter on healthcare.gov is kind of closed now. They did that tech surge. I don't know if you've checked it out recently. It's working well now. They've, in general, kind of fixed it. I think looking back, we're all going to be a little bit embarrassed about how all of that went down. I know I am. I have a lot of friends who work at HHS, and I'm not too proud of that particular moment in American history. But then looking forward, I think for us, the real question is, what do we want the next chapter to be, right? ACA isn't the last time the federal government's going to build a major website. It's not. Actually, in fact, over time, the websites are only going to get more important. And as technologists, I think it's incumbent upon us to understand that responsibility and think about how we want to be involved in that process, what culture we want to create, and how we want to make the government that we have, the institutions that we have the responsibility for, more reflective of our values and our goals. Thank you.
So web developers have a particular skill set. Is there a concern that all the problems become a nail to our hammer and like we're going to solve everything by making a web app rather than predictive analytics, rather than other technology choices?
It's a great question. So a lot of the interesting stuff happening isn't just web apps. So in New York, for instance, they did some great predictive analytics work around where to place the fire trucks. Mike Flowers, who is their open analytics officer, which also is a cool title, did some really great work around predictive analytics, both around the fire trucks, around the ambulances. Revelstone, one of the civic startups, does only predictive analytics. So really, I think holistically, and I suppose I should have emphasized that more, the question is really technology, right? How are you going to use technology to make government work better? And that ranges from web applications to data to user experience, which isn't just web apps, right? I mean, it's a lot of different things. I mean, a lot of this is honestly like marketing. I mean, a good question is, what could you do differently around street signs? What could you do differently around, I don't know. So a lot of it is, I think, more than just building web apps. So yeah, I think it's a good question.
So more of a comment than a question. I'm actually at 18F. So if
Tell Jen
anyone
hi.
here thinks any of that sounds interesting, come talk to me. Or, you know, go look into working for Philly or wherever you live. There's a lot to be done. A lot of help is needed. Do it for a year or two. It's worth it.
Good man. While she's getting can I just say, by the way, if you want to know more about predictive analytics or anything like that, we put out a book last year called Beyond Transparency, and it goes into a lot of depth about all the different opportunities there.
You said that one of the problems with the federal website was it used waterfall method, and the Kentucky website was a success. Does that mean that they used Agile for the Kentucky website?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they just had better management of it. And it was the same company, and they were just more proactive about it. And actually, a lot of states rolled out their own exchanges rather well. It was just a cultural problem. I can send whoever wants the Shirky post. He wrote a really good, I mean, there's been a lot written about ACA and the rollout, but the Shirky post goes in, I think, good depth about it.
Is it typical for state governments to have more of an agile mindset?
You know, I don't work a lot with states. I don't know if you do or not. I mean, I heard I don't know.
No.
I don't know. Is this being recorded? If this isn't being recorded, what I've heard is, I heard a funny story from somebody who does a lot of agile work with government. They said that they actually have to fake it. So they, what they do is they'll write a contract saying that they're doing waterfall, but actually they'll do Agile in their own shop and just make the deadline seem like waterfall. So basically, you wouldn't even know it if it was true. Yeah, which is sad.
So I'll try to clarify this question, but funding. I mean, so funding is the major problem that I see. You know, so in America, like, so the UK, their funding's coming from the government up above. It's a socialist, more of a socialist system. Here, especially with health and human services, we've got funds that are sequestered, and I can't even mix them in departments. And in fact, so what it does, there's a book called Extreme Government Makeover that describes the problem very well, in the sense that you've got these small little fiefdoms by the nature of just the funding. What focus have you seen, or what do we do to change this? I mean, I know Mark and other folks in the Philly area have talked about these things, but what have you seen?
So funding's really hard. I mean, so funding's both really hard and really not, to be fair, right? So when we were trying to get funding for San Francisco for the HHS project, right? So most innovation offices, right? So Mark Head was the chief data officer for Philadelphia, a good friend of mine, was actually on Code for America staff for a while. A lot of innovation offices have some budget, but not a lot. They tend to just give some staff and not a lot of budgetary backing behind them, so it's hard for them to be able to pay for things, right? It was funny when we went and talked to the head of HHS in San Francisco, and we wanted, Code for America cost about $180,000 for the 3 fellows. The head of HHS was like, that's a rounding error for me. And I was like, really? Like, every other CIO I talked to is like, they can never find budget. So in some cases they can find budget, in other cases they can't. So it's a little complicated, but I would say, first of all, funding for civic tech, if you have a good idea, you can almost always find a foundation or private backing to get it. So I would say, in general, don't let any good idea not get built, because we can find funding for it. I mean, Code for America has an annual budget of $10 million. Knight just put out a report, Knight Foundation, that there's been $370 million of funding in civic tech over the last 5 years. So there's been a lot of money thrown in this space. And frankly, some of it, I think, so there's a lot of opportunities for funding. I think in government it's a real problem. But I think what we have to do is get people to understand how important the tech is, because oftentimes people aren't putting enough money behind it, right? Because people are saying, oh, we can just think about the website later. When if you really valued it and really thought how important it is to invest in it, then you would find the money for it.
Well, and I think so. Where I'm seeing the problem is like the HHS. We focus on them specifically. They are the most well-funded.
Yeah.
PA, DPW. These folks have a lot of money.
Yeah.
And what they do is they turn this over to third party.
Really?
And so it's the Halliburtons. I'm not just using them as a reference for some maybe larger things, but the third party consultants come in and they're supposed to know all. And really, what they do is they just keep driving the bus down the same old path. Yeah. And we're not seeing that change, but yet all that money and the funding at the state level, and this is state-specific, feds are a little bit different, but the money at the state level keeps on going to those same places where, and it's not agile, and it costs millions, and they're spending a lot of money, and when you look at the services that are delivered, nothing's really changing at that ground level. And it's only when, I guess, how do we spread what's happening in the cities much more into that, the rural areas of where the state capitals actually are, to get these people to recognize what's going on?
Well, okay, so two quick thoughts.
Sorry for not.
No, totally. One is, so I was talking to an entrepreneur at a civic startup the other day, and he said the trick he's found is if you can frame the technology build as program operations, right? So if what you're doing is actually part of the programmatic outcomes of a department. So he was talking about like anti-smoking campaigns, right? So a lot of departments, for instance, I'm trying to think which department in particular has to do anti-smoking stuff, but have to do anti-smoking campaigns. If what you're doing has to relate to that programmatic activity, then you can get budget along that, right? And not, for instance, like the CIO's budget, but like the program manager's budget for the anti-smoking campaign. So if you can reframe it along those lines, so don't go to the CIO, go to the program manager, or go to whatever. So basically, try to stay out of the CIO shop, because their budgets are already identified and like line item to the consultants or the Halliburtons or whoever. Go to the other people who have different budget to basically get the day-to-day operations done. So I think that's the first thing. And the second thing about rural cities, I mean, I think the biggest challenge, so I'm from a small town of 15,000 people in southern Illinois. So what keeps me up at night is how do we make sure this technology that we're building gets there? Because that's what I care about, right? Is I want to make sure that people in those towns are getting this stuff and they're getting serviced by this stuff. And frankly, it's something we haven't cracked the code on. So if anybody has great ideas about that stuff, please tell me, because I don't think anyone's solved for that.
I don't know, like, another gap I see is the legislatures and the counties and the cities and the states are completely closed in terms of technology. You know, they can bear on tax. So, I think we, this is a coding problem. Those people who are like, they need to be more technology savvy, so people can run progress. So how to hate that thought, but
Totally.
that kind of experience.
Totally.
Another important thing.
Well, okay.
Like, ask the guy running for state senate, you know, what's he know about technology? I think we have to do more of that.
I think that's right. And to their credit, mayors are starting to get this. There's a great book, if you haven't read it, called The Metropolitan Revolution by Bruce Katz. Great book. And the basic thesis is that mayors, because of the budget cuts, because of the disarray in Washington, mayors are having to solve problems themselves because Washington isn't helping, right? And mayors, because of that, are seeing technology as a core problem. There's a great story from South Bend that the mayor there, who's like 29, he was an Army Ranger, he like runs marathons. He really annoys me because he's like so successful and awesome. But he like saved the city $100 million by putting in smart sensors in the pipes. They were gonna have to redo all of the pipes in the city, but instead they put in smart tech, and he saved the city a bunch of money. So that's to say mayors are starting to get it, but I hear you, legislators don't get it. And part of the problem with ACA was that the whole bill went through Congress. Not one person, I didn't hear it, not one person raised their hand and said, hey guys, we're gonna need a marketplace bill. Does someone wanna talk about that before we pass this bill? Does somebody wanna talk about what technology we're gonna need before any of this ink is signed on this bill and passed through the legislature and signed by the president? Like, why didn't someone MVP the app before this whole thing was built? Like, I would have done it. Like, I just don't, we're not having that conversation early enough in the process because congressmen don't understand tech and don't care. So I think that has to happen. So somebody should run for Congress. You, 18F, there you go. By the way, that's the other thing 18F should do, which is push the conversation earlier in the process and not just late. Darrell Issa, Congressman Issa gets technology. Eric Cantor spent 3 hours at the Code for America office. He understands technology too.
Well, but it's about the people in it.
Yeah.
Because you just gave us the example of Kentucky or the other implementations with the same company. So it doesn't matter if you know technology. I would say it doesn't matter about that. It matters about the people that are there on the ground. I mean, I'm seeing this every day.
I mean, what's crazy, this really isn't being recorded, right? Okay. Well, I don't really care. I don't really care. I mean, the craziest thing about it is when you look at the federal level, right, there's fantastic people there, as you know. Fantastic people there, right? Todd Park, one of the smartest, most passionate, most impressive people I've ever met in my life. Ever, right? Steve Van Rokel, CIO, amazing, right? Brian Sivak, the CTO of HHS, terrific, right? All of these people are great, so there are great people there. There are some real structural and cultural barriers, though, in place that we have to address. And hopefully things like 18F, like the Presidential Innovation Fellows, and frankly, things like ACA not working initially and then over time getting better, will start to move the conversation forward. I mean, what we saw at Code for America is sometimes you've got to break some eggs, right? Or crack some eggs. And that forces people to see the problem. And then once you start to see the problem and start to see the solution, people are like, okay, I get it, right? Let's do this stuff in a different way. Revolution. Bruce Katz.
With the, especially with the blight status site, how did they go about doing the initial analysis? Like, how did they get a hold of the people who they talked to learn about, you know, what their needs were, and how did they find that woman with the maps and all that?
So the way the fellowship works, so it's an 11-month program. The first month of fellowship, they're actually all in San Francisco, and we do a month of training. And that month of training is really on two focus areas. One is user research. So we bring in a bunch of leading experts on user research to train the fellows. A lot of the fellows don't have a UX background or user experience or research background, so we give them a lot of training on that. And then the other training we give them is a kind of negotiation frankly. Like, we actually train them on how to go into City Hall and kind of navigate the politics and all that. And then they go to the city for the next month of February and just go on the ground and talk to anybody who'll give them time. So they tend to do about 100 to 150 interviews in 28 days. So it's a lot. It's pretty intensive. They come back pretty tired. And so they just talk to everybody ranging from people like Miss Rita, people on the street, people inside city halls, community organizers, et cetera, and find out what are their problems, what are things that they're already doing. A big learning we've had is that the most successful civic tech tends to map to existing activity. Like, you don't want to get people to do new things. What you want to do is find tech that helps them do what they're already doing a little bit better. And so they tend to research and find out what they're already doing, which is what they did in New Orleans. Did that answer the question?
So I've seen that a lot of the more traditional government apps, the waterfall kind of apps, have some maintenance issues in the long run. Essentially, they're too expensive to maintain, and people that worked on them kind of leave, and then they just kind of get old and archaic. Do you see that new agile apps have better maintenance or better maintenance plans? And do you see the momentum after CFA comes into a city being sustained in the future?
So, great question. So I think those are two related but somewhat distinct questions. So I think in terms of maintenance, in general, the stuff that's built in a more modern, agile way does tend to be maintained better, mostly because when it's done in the best way, which is agile and open source, and built a community around it, right? So some of the stuff, particularly Code for America, has built that's gotten a community built around it on, say, like GitHub or another open source platform, you really see people keep maintaining it. For instance, like this thing, Adopt a Hydrant, which we built in 2011, which like lets people adopt hydrants to maintain them and like shovel them out when it snows in the community, gets people contributing to it every day and keeping it up to date. So things like that actually get a lot of support. And particularly in government, as folks who work in government know, like Drupal, for instance, this content management system is really popular. And when governments use things like that, those tend to be really well maintained because there's a very active community of Drupal developers. And things like that, again, get lots of maintenance. Now, Code for America sustainability is a really great question, right? And it's something I think we think about a lot. And so our biggest metric of success at Code for America is actually institutional change. So is there impact in policy or legal reform in the city after the fellows are done or after CFA is done in the city? Because we know the fellows are going to be gone. And so what that usually looks like is, does the city pass an open data policy? Did they appoint someone like Mark Head, like a chief data officer, right? Because that's the way we would feel confident that there would be some kind of sustainability beyond the fellowship. So it's interesting, right? Code for America is building tech, but the real value, the real metric or the real outcomes isn't just the technology, it's the institutionalization of the change the technology represents. Great.